Violence causes trauma all over the world, and I'd like to talk to you about how people telling their own stories can stop violence in their lives and in the lives of others. Most of us would prefer not to think about violence most of the time. But for people who live in urban slums, for example, they don't have this option because violence is an everyday, in-your-face kind of reality. Maybe one of the reasons that we don't like to think about it is it's hard to see what can you contribute to a solution when the scale of the problem just seems so big. Dota is a young man from a township in Cape Town, and he's smart, and he's funny, and he's really articulate. And he's also a former gangster, former drug addict, and prison inmate. I'd like to share with you the story that Dota told a couple of months ago. Dota was raised by his grandmother after he was abandoned by his mother, who was an alcoholic. And he loved his grandmother very much. And when she died, he felt like he had lost the only person in the world who cared for him. He ended up on the streets, robbing, stabbing, and eventually going to prison. And when he was in prison, he decided that he wanted to come out and be someone that people trusted again. And so when he came out of prison, he started to work with Sonke Gender Justice in Cape Town, going and speaking to small groups of young men in his community about how to stop violence. Now, the easiest thing for Dota would have been to go straight back to his old life, because frankly, he doesn't have very many other opportunities. But he's trying to stick to his commitment, even without knowing if his story is going to have a happy ending. So, Dota's story is not about the moment when he was in prison and he decided to change. Dota's story is about how he has to hold on to that commitment every day, even when it's hard. Why does Dota's story matter? The current response to violence is bigger. Bigger police forces, bigger prisons, higher walls, longer sentences, stronger militaries. And these things, they may help, but they're not enough. And there's something that's missing from this solution. For a lot of people in the world, violence comes from a place that you least expect it. It comes from a friend, a parent, a police officer, or a lover. And yet, there are people like Dota who are willing to stand up to the violence in their own lives and the lives of others. I work with stories. I try to help people to tell their own personal stories using their creativity and their experiences as a reference, and then using technology to amplify what they have to say. And once people have been able to tell that story, that powerful story that they have, they can tell it over and over. And in doing that, they're able to take hold of their own story and change it. And I've worked with many people around the world to do this, and I've really learned a lot from them. And I want to share with you what are some of the elements that help people to use their stories to stop violence. And the first one is this. It's space. When you live in a really violent situation, you don't have time to sit and ponder the meaning of violence in your life because you're too busy trying to survive. You're worried about the fact that your roof is leaking and you don't have enough money to buy food and you need someone to watch your kids so that you can go and get a job. And what you need is a safe space where you can take a step back and look at your life through a bigger perspective and try and understand what that violence means to you. Tuli is a young woman from a township in Johannesburg and a friend of mine, and she was raped as a child. And after the rape, her parents didn't want to talk about it, she didn't want to think about it, she was just supposed to move on. And it was years later in a storytelling workshop when Tuli was able to go back to that experience and think about not just the rape, but what it had meant to her and what she could do about it. And now, Tuli helps other people to tell their stories, and she's really good at it. And she uses her experience of having told her own story to help other people to tell theirs. And so when you're in this safe space and you can tell your story, the second thing that you need is recognition. So you're sharing your story, and it's about something that's really hard. What you need is someone who's sitting opposite you saying, I see you, I hear you, and you matter. It's that recognition, that sense that someone is acknowledging what your experience has been that helps people to be able to tell those stories. Now, this point goes far beyond just storytelling. If you think about violence in general, it's about a lack of empathy. Take, for example, the Balkans. You had people who'd been friends and neighbors for years suddenly start killing each other in really terrible ways. And this was partly about a failure of empathy. It was about no longer being able to see one another as a mother, a father, a brother, or a sister, and seeing them as us and them. And once you get us and them divisions, you can justify almost anything. And so what we need is to put the empathy back in. And that means you have to be able to connect to someone as a person, and this is what stories help us to do, because people, in telling their stories, are putting themselves into the story, and that breaks down these kinds of assumptions. And it helps connect people beyond rhetoric. And that's element number 3, connections. So when you're telling your story about your commitment to try and stop violence, the fact that there are other people who have that same commitment, who are willing to take the same kinds of risks, it makes it easier for you to do the same. And this is, again, a point that goes way beyond storytelling. We need to get people from the favelas of Rio and the townships of Cape Town and Ferguson, Missouri, to be able to connect to one another. And I'm talking about the direct connection of people who are working at the grassroots, who really understand the problems that they're trying to face. And it can be done in many ways. It can happen through online forums, through visits, exchanges, and workshops, but what's important is that it's about a quality connection. I was working with a man named Zoran in Bosnia, and he was a soldier in the war and eventually became a translator in the peace. And I was working with him on social projects. And we were doing a storytelling project in Bosnia, and it was for people to tell their own stories of how they'd made a change in their community and what had been hard about that. And at the end of all of this, I asked Zoran, what did you get out of this work? And what he said was, what he had gotten was the sense that there was a whole nother world out there of people who believe that they can make a difference and are trying to make a difference, first in their lives and in the lives of others, and that he could be connected to them. And that's what the storytelling process can help people to do, is to make these connections. So where does this take us? I've been talking about the elements that help people to stop violence in their own lives. But what about in the lives of other people? Well, there's 2 that I'd like to share with you. And the first one is about the small, seemingly very ordinary, everyday types of acts that are really needed to stop violence. So sometimes stopping violence is like standing in front of a tank. But most of the time, stopping violence is about the small, ordinary things that add up to make a much bigger change. And what the storytelling process helps people to do is to recognize what those things are, to see them differently. It's about like invisible threads that connect violence into our lives. So I was working with a man named Alcir from a favela here in Rio, and he's a community leader and a brilliant music teacher. And we were watching 2 young boys who were playing with model wooden replica guns, and they were having a gun battle over the tops of some cars. And he turned to me and he said, I tell their parents, don't let your kids play with those guns, because it isn't play, it's practice. And in the context of the favela, he's absolutely right. Those would be real guns shooting real bullets in a couple of years at the most. And so it was a storytelling process that helped Al-Sir to be able to see that something as innocent as children's games in the streets is exactly what needs to be changed to get a solution to violence. But I think there's something else that stories help us do, which might be even more important. And that's about being able to stand up for negotiation and dialogue. So, when everything is about to kick off, when the situation is about to explode, what you need is someone who can push pause, who can get people to stop and start talking when they're ready to start shooting. I was working with a group of activists in Khayelitsha, which is another township in South Africa, and I asked them, how do you go out from your shack into your neighbor's shack and stop a man who's about to beat up his wife? How do you do that? And the answer was, we go in and we start talking. And if they kick us out, we come back, we talk to them some more. And if they don't like it, we keep talking. And in fact, we keep talking until we get them to listen. And this is what we need. We need the people who can take those kinds of risks, who are able to get the husband to sit down with the wife, to get the gangs and the police in the same room, to get governments and terrorists to talk to one another. So all these elements are really important for how people are able to stop violence in their lives. Because in telling their story, what they're doing is they're taking hold of the narrative of who they are, and they're changing it. And that's a really powerful process. I have seen people use their stories to do really amazing things. I've seen them tell their friends and communities and families things they were never able to speak about before. I've seen them go to a policymaker who just didn't want to listen and cut through piles and stacks of reports straight to that person's heart and get them to pay attention. I have seen people use their stories to get their governments to stop and listen. There's no guarantee with this approach. Every person who tells their story is not magically going to become an activist, although it would be nice. And there are plenty of people out there who haven't had this opportunity, who really should and really do need to tell their stories. But I think that the process of telling your story can spark something powerful, and stories can show us a different kind of a way. Think how different the responses of the government, of police departments, of crime prevention units, of peacekeeping forces, think how different it would be if they really took this commitment that people had to try and stop violence in their lives and the lives of others seriously. So Dota and Tuli and Zoran and Al-Sir and many others like them have had the courage to tell their own stories. And in doing that, they have rewritten a lot of how we see them. They have rewritten how they see themselves. And they have changed the possibilities for what they can do. It may seem like a very small thing to listen to their stories, but I know them, and I can tell you it's not a small thing at all. It's actually really big. And in listening to these stories, what's happening is that we can recognize the courage that they've had. We can interrupt the cycle of violence. We can contribute to a solution. Thank you.